Welcome to episode 91 of your Daily Dose of Sunday School. We continue with Greg Koukl's Tactics. We're on chapter 17, Just the Facts Man. We've looked at how a lot of things that gain popularity and are repeated often by unbelievers, one might assume that they're hard to refute. But Koukl's demonstrated that we shouldn't be afraid of that. We should look into it. Very often they're extremely easy to refute. First thing he looks at, well, actually we've looked at several things already. First thing we're going to talk about today is the book The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Now this book is old, and I might have wanted to skip this part, except for the fact that these things do tend to come back around. Maybe they'll make a sequel or the reboot of it. I don't know. There was a movie based on it. Anyway, basically what Dan Brown seemed to have done, either he assumed all his readers would be terribly historically uninformed, or he himself was just terribly historically uninformed. He makes absurd statements. And quickly look at a few of those and then move on. He claims that for the first 300 years of the church, there was a war between pagans and Christians. For one thing, Christians were the ones being persecuted by the pagans. They're the ones being killed. Many of the Christians were pacifists. And so it's the pagan government that had all the power. It was the Christians who were conquering by the word of their testimony and receiving punishment for the name of Christ without fighting back. And yet, I guess to deal with that unrest, Constantine supposedly calls the Council of Nicaea for political purposes. Okay, so this is just Dan Brown's claim. And at the council, supposedly they fabricated the doctrine of Jesus' deity. Like, apparently the church, according to Dan Brown, didn't believe Jesus was God before then. And it's so absurd because every single person involved in the council, even Arius, that the council whose teaching the council ended up refuting, believed that Jesus was more than a mere man. The council's decision was confirmed 318 delegates to 2. And this was not, the council was not making up things. The people there believed that Jesus, everyone believed that Jesus was more than a mere man. And even Arius, whose teaching was refuted, Arius was teaching that he was more like a lesser deity, created deity type thing. And so it's just absurd. And then supposedly Constantine demanded that all copies of the gospel that didn't teach, or all copies of the gospel that taught that Jesus was a mere mortal should be destroyed. And yet, wouldn't that just be all copies of the gospel if the Council of Nicaea invented the doctrine of Jesus' deity? That doesn't make sense. And so apparently they rounded up all these copies of the gospel, and yet Dan Brown still has amazing secret knowledge of what was said, even though these were so rounded up and destroyed. And supposedly from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have evidence of this early Christian teaching that Jesus was just a man. Well, that's so dumb. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Jewish writings. You've got the Old Testament and certain Jewish books. This is Jews who were trying to escape the wickedness of the world and went out into a cave to live. This wasn't a Christian group. I think Dan Brown got confused at the fact that Christians are always appealing to the Dead Sea Scrolls to be like, oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they prove things right. It's just absurd. And Koukl also says, hey, The just the facts, ma'am, will also work with Scripture. People make all sorts of absurd claims about Scripture, kind of like Dan Brown has, and you can do a little research and be able to refute those and defend the faith. So he talks about debating with, I think, Deepak Chopra, and Chopra claimed that the King James Version was the 18th iteration of the Scriptures, and clearly claiming that there was like the telephone game going on, and it was just getting worse and worse until the King James Version of the Bible, which is not at all how Bible translation works. Now, the King James Version in some ways did rely on previous translations of the Bible, because the King James Version is not that good of a translation, and because Erasmus, who he created the Textus Receptus that it's based on, didn't have a lot to work with. But the simple refutation of that is that every modern translation of the Bible is based on the reconstruction of the original Greek. Best way to say that. So we have all these documents. It's not at all like Dan Brown says, where it's all these different documents claiming different things. We have all these documents of the original apostolic writing, and there are slight variations that it's 99% of the time easy to tell which one came later and which one we should go with. And so we're not playing the telephone game with Scripture at all. So whatever you want to say against the King James Version, which I think even that was untrue, but even that has nothing to do with how reliable modern translations are even. They're actually very reliable.